Today we will be replacing the stock manifolds on this 1996 Impala SS with a nice set of performance exhaust headers. So today I will take you through the step-by-steps of how to remove your stock exhaust manifolds and how to install your new headers along with the high-performance catalytic converters. The few things you will need to make sure that you have before you start this project are a couple of replacement O2 sensors for the front before the catalytic converter, a pair of exhaust header gaskets, a complete set of new bolt hardware for the gaskets. On this particular install, you should have the following items to make on this particular install. The customer has made sure that he has all the items that he wants to replace. In this case, 2 new O2 sensors for before the catalytic converters, a new set of exhaust header gaskets, a complete new set of header bolts, both the catalytic converters and both the headers. You want to make sure you have all your accessories and hardware that you're going to need prior to doing the install. One of the first things you're going to have to do in this project is to spray some PB Blast or any kind of good penetrating oil into or onto all of the exhaust manifold bolts, which there are 6 on each side. You're also going to want to spray penetrating oil onto all of the exhaust manifold flange bolts, which, let me see if I can get this to zoom in a little bit. Yes, those 3 exhaust manifold flange bolts, you'll want to spray them from the top and from the bottom. So, first step in this entire project to access all the bolts would be to jack up the front of the car and secure it with jack stands. Okay, now that you have the car up on jack stands and you sprayed down the bolts, the exhaust manifold flange bolts, with some PB Blast or other penetrating oil, you'll also want to soak the connecting bolts back here where the rear of the exhaust catalytic converter connects to the rest of the catback system. The first thing you're going to remove on this vehicle is both of the catalytic converters. You're going to need to do that, otherwise if you disconnect the exhaust manifolds with the catalytic converter still attached, you're not going to be able to get them out. So be sure to remove the catalytic converters first, and also be sure, very important, to disconnect the wire plugs on the O2 sensors, which you have 4 on this particular vehicle. One on each side before the catalytic converter and 1 on each side after the catalytic converters. So once you let the PV Blast or penetrating lube soak into the bolts for a little while, then you may begin disassembly. Okay, one thing you need to do, it's very important, because you don't want to shock yourself against a starter while you're working on this project. So, before you disassemble anything, disconnect the ground cable for your battery. Just disconnect it and put it out of the way. That way, your electrical system on the vehicle is disabled. Okay, now that you got your battery disconnected, you got your car up on the jack stands, it's time to start removing the catalytic converters. Now, for the stock bolts, you'll need a 15mm, just regular shallow socket, and a ratchet in order to remove these factory bolts. You can get them loose, and then you should be able to take the rest of them out by hand. Now, on the passenger side, you'll see that there's an extra little bracket here that holds the rear of the catalytic converter in place, and it is a different size bolt. For that, you will need a 13mm shallow socket and a ratchet. Now, there are usually 2 bolts to this, but this particular customer had installed a Dynomax catback system recently, and they only decided to put back 1 bolt. But that's really all it was required to keep the catalytic converter steady. So once you undo this 13mm bolt from the bracket, or in your case both of them if you have stock exhaust, or you have, even if you have aftermarket exhaust but you had installers that were good enough to put all the bolts back on. Get that bolt removed, and getting these two bolts removed. So it looks pretty smooth. So once those bolts are removed, the rear of the catalytic converter is loose and ready to be removed. But you have to remove the 3 flange bolts in order to remove the whole catalytic converter. Okay, on the driver's side, catalytic converter, you don't have a bracket that hooks up the catalytic converter to the transmission crossmember mount here. So the only thing you have is this 2 50mm socket bolts. So break them loose. Now remember, you sprayed some PB Blaster penetrating oil on these a little earlier, so they should be fairly easy to come out. But once you get one of them broken loose, the other side usually just comes loose because both of them are tension bolts. So, put it on there. That's one. This one still has a little bit of tension. Okay, now you can see the pipe is loose from the catalytic converter. So your next step is to disconnect the O2 sensors on each catalytic converter. Remember, there's one in the front and one before the catalytic converter and one after the catalytic converter. You want to disconnect all those 2 wires on each side of the car before you continue. Okay, now we're on the driver's side. We're going to disconnect the rear O2 sensor. Now this one has already been removed from its little clip, which you can see here, which actually clips up toward the top of the transmission. But a good set of needle nose pliers will be able to remove that. So what you need to do now is remove this little white clip, which you also could just use a set of needle nose pliers or a flathead screwdriver. Pull that little white clip out. Disconnect your wire. Tuck the original wire harness away and just let the O2 sensor wire hang loose. On the driver's side for the front O2 sensor, if it's still packed in the factory setting, you're going to need to undo knock sensor right here, remove the wire around the loop, and you got all this tape up here, which is actually wrapped up around the O2 sensor plug. So just pull it off. It's going to take a good tug, and you'll want to remove the tape. And once you've removed the tape, then you have free access to the plug. Now again, you have this little clip here, which just take your needle nose, just get that little white lock tab out of the way, and disconnect your O2 sensor. Now remember, you're not going to plug this or your knock sensor back in yet, but you do need to unwrap the O2 sensor wire from around the hard oil cooler line. So once you got that out of the way, you're ready to dismantle the 3 flange bolts for this catalytic converter, and you can drop the catalytic converter without any problems. Okay, you'll need a 15mm socket using a 1/2" drive ratchet to get these bolts loose. Now, don't be alarmed if the whole stud comes out of the exhaust manifold. Sometimes that just happens, because these bolts are, after all, over a decade old, since this is a 96. So, you get all 3 of these bolts loose. Once you got them all nice and loose, if you need to go to a smaller size ratchet for more turning room, like a 3/8 drive ratchet, you can. That's a lot of force to break these things loose with a 3/8 drive ratchet. You don't really want to use air tools on this, because if you do, you may end up breaking one of the studs out of the exhaust manifold. Even though you're replacing them with headers, if you ever needed to sell the manifolds to someone that needed them, or something ever happened to the headers and you needed to put the manifolds back on, you want to be able to make sure they're in good shape. Okay. It looks like the nut came off the stud on this one. That's one. Okay. And in this case, the whole stud came off, the intake manifold. Now the last bolt, you're going to want to be very careful with, because once you undo this bolt, the whole catalytic converter is going to be not fastened to anything. That nice rust is making a catch. Okay, the whole stud came out of this one too. So, gotta keep my hand on there. Get rid of the bolt. Use both arms. Disconnect it from the other side of the pipe. And there it is. You just drop the catalytic converter. Now make sure you pull off this old flange gasket. So now that you have that out of the way, you can actually begin the disassembly of the exhaust manifold from the. Sorry. But before you do that, disconnect the number 7 cylinder spark plug wire and get it out of the way, so that way you have more room to drop your header on in the car when you install it. Your side, remember, you got to disconnect the cable. Now this one also has a tab right here that was locked on a plate toward the top of the tail housing of the transmission, so you got to undo that with a screwdriver. Then you just pop it loose and let it hang. On the front, the wire is attached to another plate way up here, which also you got to disconnect with a screwdriver. And again, with the same kind of deal with the you'll unlock the wire, you let the wire hang loose, leave the other wires hanging up where they are, and now that you've got it disconnected from the back pipe and you've got the wires disconnected, now you can disconnect the flange bolts and drop this catalytic converter on the passenger side. Okay, now that you got both your catalytic converters removed, now you can focus on the engine and you can actually begin the disassembly of the exhaust manifolds from the engine. But the first thing you have to do is you have to disconnect the air pump plumbing, which is this and this piece on the driver's side. And on the passenger side, you have this check valve here along with this plumbing here. Now, on the passenger side, just to make the job a little easier, you want to go ahead and remove your alternator. Now, it only takes about 5 minutes. You're undoing, one wire clip, a wire bolt, 2 bolts, a back brace, and it's pretty much removed. So let's go ahead and get the alternator out before we continue. Okay, the first step in removing your alternator, you want to take off the serpentine belt. Now for that, on the stock tensioner, you're going to need a 13mm, which I'm using a deep socket, and a 3/8 drive ratchet. Simply put the ratchet on the tensioner pulley, push down, remove the belt from the alternator, put it back up, and you're done. And just tuck away the belt, just kind of pull it away so that way it does not get in your way as you're installing your headers. Okay, the next step in removing the alternator is getting rid of this battery cable, which again you can just use a 13mm socket. Remove the nut, slide the cable off, put the nut back in its place so that way you can save it for later. Now, one way that I tuck this out of the way so it's not in your way later, lift up the power steering pump reservoir, put the cable underneath it, and just put it back down. It actually makes a nice little device to getting the cable out of the way. Your next step is to just pick the clip and get rid of this wire, take it off the alternator, and just tuck it away. Now, the next thing you're going to need is a 15mm wrench and a 13mm shallow socket. This is for stock vehicles that have the stock hardware. So, 15mm nut on the back of the 13mm bolt. Just undo. Put the nut and bolt back together so you know what goes with what. Put it away somewhere where you can find it later. And you get the bottom one. Okay. Put that back together. Get that out of the way. Okay, now you only have one more bolt holding the alternator on. And the only thing that's in the way is the plumbing for your check valve. So you can just pull this out of the way. And if this gets in your way, the oil filler neck, you can actually just unbolt it. And I'm not talking about just the cap. You can remove it like that, get that out of the way, then you just put it back. Okay, now that that's out of the way, you can use a 13mm socket or a wrench. And remove the rear bracket bolt. Okay, put that with the other alternator bolts, and voila! The alternator comes right out. Set it aside, and you just opened up more room for your front exhaust bolt right there. Okay, now that you got your alternator removed, you notice you got this bracket and this bracket. Well, this one we're going to keep, but this one we're going to go ahead and get rid of. We don't really need it anymore, especially when you're putting headers on. So, what you need to remove it from the exhaust manifold stud is a 9/16 deep socket with a 3/8 drive ratchet. You just get it on there, break loose the nut, turn it a few rotations, and it's loose. Now the only thing that's going to hold it on is this little wire clip, which you just squeeze and get rid of this wire clip. And there it is. You remove this bracket, you discard it, you don't need it anymore.
Okay.
Okay, you want to tuck these wires out of the way so you can have clear room at the first exhaust manifold bolt. Now you're going to reuse that stud, so be careful in removing it. Now you want to get rid of this. Just pull this out of the way, tuck it away so you won't break it. So now you have clear access to the nut that's holding on this particular bracket. Now for that, you're going to need a 9/16 shallow socket, because the nut is right on the end of the stud, if you can see that down there.
Yes.
Okay. So you take your 9/16 with a shallow socket, put it on 3/8 drive ratchet. Doesn't take a whole lot of force to get it loose. Don't lose the nut. Take off this bracket. Remember which way it goes too. This section right here is always going to go on the alternator. This bottom section is always going to go onto the stud for the exhaust manifold. Now there is a difference. I mean, you can flip it upside down, but here's the way to tell. This bracket that goes on the alternator is a little bit shorter as far as the flat section. The part that goes on the exhaust manifold, or your header, is a bit longer. So that's how you remember this is the bottom, this is the top. Set that aside. Okay. Okay, now that you got your brackets out of the way on the passenger side, you want to take some PB Blast or just any kind of penetrating oil and spray the connection down real good for the check valve pipe to the exhaust manifold. Now while you got the penetrating oil or PB Blast out, also go to the driver's side, go ahead and spray that down too, let it soak in. So while you're letting that soak, you can go ahead and remove the rubber hardware. Off of the check valve. Just like that. And discard it. Now, this customer has opted to not use the air pump anymore. So we're going to be disabling the air pump in the process, which means we're going to be getting rid of this plumbing here, which is a basic U-pipe that goes all the way under the engine and goes on up onto the driver's side, and there's a little T-section that goes into your air pump. But since it's no longer needed, and the new headers do not have the pipes coming out to compensate for the air pump, we're going to go ahead and get rid of it. Okay, since we're removing the air pump hardware off the exhaust manifold, you might be asking why we're doing this since we're getting rid of the exhaust manifold anyway. Well, getting this out of the way allows for more maneuvering room to get the exhaust manifolds out. So that's the only reason we're doing that. And you're going to need two 1-inch open end box end wrenches to get this loose. So you get the bottom part, which is the adapter for the 96, and the top, okay, which is the coupling for that. And voila. For the passenger side, that's gone. Now while we have the wrenches out, let's go to the driver's side and see if it'll come off just as easy. So I hope it should. So we still have this hardware to remove. It's very simple clips to get these out of the way. No real special tools are required. I mean, you can use a screwdriver if you'd like. Get those out of the way. Now again, 1 inch and 1 inch, and there you go. Now that's out of the way. So now both exhaust manifolds are free from the air pump hardware, and they're free from the catalytic converter. So the only thing that's holding them in to the engine now is 6 bolts. So all we got to do now, remove the 6 bolts, and we'll be able to remove one exhaust manifold, and then we'll remove the other, and we'll install the headers. Okay, to remove the exhaust manifold on the passenger side, you actually have 7 bolts that are holding the thing on. There are 6 up here on the top, and there's 1 bolt that's holding the EGR pipe down below that goes to the back of your intake manifold. So what you want to do first because there's really hardly any room to get under there now to remove that EGR pipe bolt. And the reason for that is because your transmission dipstick tube is right in the way. So instead of unbolting that and moving it out of the way, we're going to loosen up all the bolts, all 6 bolts on this exhaust manifold, and we're going to pull it out a little bit, and that way as it's loose you can have room underneath the vehicle to torque down on the bolt to get it loose. So let's start by removing or breaking loose all the bolts on top of the passenger side exhaust manifold, which in this case it looks like we needed. They're 9/16 bolts, and sometimes for the stud you don't have a whole lot of room at all. So the 9/16 would be too deep. The 9/16 shallow would be just you'd be able to get the socket on there but not the ratchet. And that's with the 3/8 drive ratchet. So what you want to do is you want to get the 9/16 socket with a 1/2 inch drive ratchet. It's a little deeper than this, so you'll be able to get it without a problem. So you get the 9/16 on the 1/2 inch drive.
It's a big ratchet.
Yep. You gotta get it in there first. So get the socket in there. Get your ratchet in there. Well, guess what? That's not going to work either on this particular vehicle. So it looks like we're going to the wrench. 9/16 ratchet wrench. Now you don't want to remove it completely right now. You just want to break it loose enough, a few complete turns, so that way you can space the manifold away from the head enough to move around that EGR bolt. Okay, so you got that one loose. Next up, the factory bolt has a spacer on it, but still the shallow socket is too shallow. You don't have room. So you want to use one of these really short extensions, because it's still, as you can see, it's shorter than the deep socket, because you want to have room to get the ratchet on there. Just like that. Okay. Now, remember the third one is actually a stud, so you will need the deep socket regardless. But there's still that nut on there. Sometimes that rust makes it a little bit stubborn. Get rid of that. Okay. This one's really on there. So I'm going to have to get a cheater bar.
That sucks.
Get your cheater bar. Okay.
Okay.
Next one in is the shallow socket, the number 4 bolt. Shallow socket with a standard, like 3-inch extension. Okay. Now when you have the cats off, sometimes it's a lot easier to access the rear bolts from underneath. But for this video's sake, okay. Now we've got the bolts loose. Can move the manifold around a little bit. So now I'm going to go into the car and remove the EGR pipe bolt that's still holding everything together. Okay, you see where the wrench is attached already to the EGR pipe bolt. You could use a 1/2-inch ratchet wrench, which is what I'm using, and just make sure you've got it turned to loosen, and that way you pry right up, and you loosen the bolt. Now the cool part is that the transmission pipe, the dipstick tube, will actually keep pressure on the wrench holding it to the EGR pipe. So once you have that removed, then you can go back up top, complete loosening all the exhaust manifold bolts, and pull the exhaust manifold out from the top. Okay, now we have the EGR pipe disconnected from the manifold. So now you want to go back and just go ahead and remove the bolts. Now you don't need to worry about, well, I should say the only bolt you really need to worry about is this first bolt, because that's the stud you're going to reuse in order to fasten the alternator back using 3 bracket points instead of just 2. So, get it loose enough. Go ahead and remove. And you keep it just like this. Include the spacer on that too, because it does space out the appropriate distance from the header or exhaust manifold to actually go for the bracket that goes from the mounting point to the back of the alternator. So we have that one out of the way, and that's the only one we're going to keep. So now go to the second bolt. See how annoying this plumbing gets in the way?
Yeah. Probably had like some tape.
number 2.
Okay. Yep.
I don't know why this one's so difficult to remove. Unless an installer used some Teflon tape on it or something. Or some thread lock. Oh, that one was rusted pretty well.
Okay. And
Bolt number 4.
yep.
Almost felt easy enough to come out by fingertips.
Hey Jerry.
Hmm?
If I can't go to Devin's house tomorrow, because what I was thinking.
Okay, we're on the last bolt. You can already see how it's, coming apart. The last bolt's being kind of stubborn. There we almost got it. Now, holding the manifold while you're cranking out the last bolt is a good thing. You don't want it to drop and break your spark plugs. And the other thing is that you can put pressure against the bolt to get it out. Otherwise, your socket and your ratchet's just going to freewheel. There we go. So now I'm still holding on to this. It's not resting on the spark plugs. There's a wire you gotta get it away from.
It's not that heavy, is it?
You gotta pull the oil dipstick tube out of the way a little bit. Watch out for wires on top. And there you go. Exhaust manifold completely removed. Let's see. And you want to get all the remaining gasket material off of the vehicle. Which looks like this had a serious exhaust leak in the back. Number 8 cylinder. Now, whoever installed these spark plug wires actually did not do a very great job because they're all very tight, wrapped around each other, and this one doesn't even have the spark plug completely on the spark plug. So, can fix that while we're here. Okay. Okay. Now that this is removed, I see that there was a broken bolt over here, if you can get that.
Oh, let me see if I can zoom in.
On the number 8 cylinder.
Yes, I can see it now.
A broken bolt right there. So I'm going to spray some PB Blast on there, and hopefully I can get it out with a pair of channel locks, because there's enough of it sticking out that it should be able to grip on it and hopefully remove it. So, spray some PB Blast on there. Let that soak. And while that's soaking, we can go to work and removing the driver's side exhaust manifold. So, let's go over there. Okay, now we're going to remove the driver's side exhaust manifold. You can use a ratchet wrench for the front bolt. Very nice thing to have. Now once we have this exhaust manifold off, I'm going to go ahead and remove the plumbing for the air pump, because a customer requested that I do that. So that'll get rid of this big nice black box down here underneath the intake pipe.
Big back box. Oh, I see the box.
Don't talk.
Okay.
So now we're not keeping any of these bolts from this side, the driver's side exhaust manifold. Which, by the way, this manifold is already missing the bolts that actually hold the number 7 cylinder pipe to the head. Both of them are already gone, which is a common issue with these cars. They've always had that kind of problem with the last 2 bolts working their way loose. So it is what it is, right? Okay. Now for the second bolt, you're actually going to want to use that short nubby extension I mentioned earlier and the shallow 9/16 socket. It actually gets the ratchet just in between the manifold and these brake lines. Now the number 3 bolt is actually a stud, so you're going to need the deep socket regardless, and you're going to want to pull these brake lines over just a little bit so you can have some room. So you slide the deep socket on there. Remember to pull these lines out of the way. There you go. Just like that. I'm gonna need the cheater bar on this one again. Let me get that right quick. Okay. Now the brake lines will actually hold the ratchet in place for you. I don't know why this one's being so stubborn. Okay. Now, since the rear two bolts are already missing, so only one more bolt holding this thing on, and you can use the shallow 9/16 socket, your standard extension. There you go. Line that up. There, now the whole manifold's coming loose. Remember to hold on to the manifold. You don't want it to drop on your spark plugs. That's it. Pull it straight up. Dismiss the old gasket material, and there it is. The head is completely exposed. All the wires look okay, except for this one's not on the spark plug completely. So now that we got those all straightened out. Okay, now that we've let this bolt soak a little bit with the PB blast, let's see if we can get it out with a pair of channel locks. Now you want to be careful not to use too much torque because you don't want to break this. I mean, you can take this off of your temperature sensor, but you know, it's good to leave that all on there and sealed up and everything else with the heat shield. So let's see if this will come off. Hey, looks like we got ourselves a winner. Good for the customer. Yep, it's rotating out of there, which is a good thing. Yeah, since this is not a socket, you're only kind of doing like maybe a 1/6 or an 1/8 of a turn at a time, since you don't have a whole lot of leverage. Well, you got the leverage, just not the working room. So close. And we got it. Lucky customer. Now we don't have to drill and tap anything. So, okay, now that we have all the bolts removed out of the passenger side, while I'm here and I have clear access to it, I'm going to go ahead and see if any of the spark plugs are loose, because I noticed on the driver's side there was a little bit of oil spitting out by one of the spark plugs, almost like you can see here. Now that just tells me that the spark plug's not on there tight. So let's see about this.
I zoomed in a little bit so you see it.
Okay. Whoa, nope. That's not real tight at all for a spark plug. So hopefully you will not be leaking any more oil. And I would love to know who put these spark plug wires on, because they're not correct. Okay. Now this is just like a little preventative maintenance to do, you know, while you have the ease of access to everything and it's right there. Actually, if you were going to change out your plugs and wires, it would actually be a great time to do that right about now. Okay. Okay. Yeah, there we go. Make sure all those plugs are nice and tight. Yeah, there we go. All the plug wires are back where they need to be. Okay, now let's remove, well, I'll show you in another video how to remove the air pump bracket, the air pump assembly, but we'll get back to the headers in just a moment. Okay, now to begin the install, we're going to start off with 2 bolts and the header itself. We're not going to worry about the gasket just yet. We're actually going to just try to get it fit, because once you get the front and the rear bolt fit, you can slide the gasket right in and you won't have any problems. So you might have to bend these brake lines out of the way just a little bit to get everything in place. Just going to have to remove that for now. Yeah, get in there. Just like that. So, try to get the rearmost bolt started first. Now you only need to start at a few threads. Then you lower the front. And you start the front bolt with just a few threads. Just like that. See, now you've actually got it where you can move things around. You have plenty of room to work, and let the header just hang down. So now the next step is you got to get your header gasket, which I already have. So, and they slide right in because they have these little hooks in the front and the rear. They slide right in like that. They catch, and the ports just line right up. So, in this case, the customer has a bolt broken off right at the number 7 cylinder. Now it's the inner bolt, but the flanges are so thick on these headers, we're not going to worry about it too much. Because otherwise you have to drill it out and possibly retap the hole if you can't get that bolt out. So you have 3 bolts remaining. Now you're going to have to install these with all the slack you need, because on headers, because of how the tubes are bent, you literally have to put them all in an equal distance. So you try to get them all started. Try to get them all about the same distance as you have the first and the last one. Just like that. Okay, so now that you have pretty much the 5 bolts that are going to go in this one to a good distance, except for this one, which doesn't look like it's getting caught on the weld, so let me get the wrench and torque it up a little bit.
Getting the wrench.
Now this hardware only requires a 10mm wrench to get them going. Now this is a professional edition, which means that this box end of the wrench is very, very slim, and that's actually what you want to use for headers, because there is very little tolerance between, as you can see, the bolts and the pipes of the header. So like I said earlier, you want to get these evenly torqued in. So now that one's going in a little bit, you got to do this one, because this one, the pipe is bending toward the bolt. So you need to get these first. The first and last bolt, you don't actually have to put those in, the rest of the way, but the inner bolts you do. And this one's actually going in pretty well by hand. So we just torque that up by hand a little bit. Okay. Well, some people, when they install headers, they try to do one bolt at a time, and they try to fasten it down so it's flush against the head, and they end up having to back all the bolts out and start over again because one of them is stuck up against the tube of the header. There's not enough tolerance in here for a ratchet wrench, unfortunately, so this is how it's got to be done. Make sure the gasket's in there snug. Okay. Now there's just barely enough gap in here to get the wrench on this bolt, so you want to get that one down next. So now you can see the header starting to flush up against the head. Now you don't want to torque them just yet. You want to leave everything just kind of snug for the moment, because you don't want to compress that gasket just yet. You just want to get them all snug for now. Evenly snug though. again, you're going to need a lot of patience to do this because you're only going to have so much room to work. Okay, so that one's a little snug. That one's a little snug. That one's a little snug. And work them from the inside out. Now you have the front and the rear bolts to do, which thank goodness they're going in this easy. So you just snug them up. Okay, the back one's being a little bit stubborn, so we're going to need to wrench it. And actually, I'm going to be able to access it easier from underneath the car. There's actually more room to wrench the bolt from underneath the car, so I'm going to go underneath the car and finish up. There is no tolerance for a ratchet wrench, but the pipe is not bending toward this bolt, so you don't have to worry about it too much. But you do want to get it snugged up just like the rest of them, because before you install the catalytic converter, you have to put the O2 sensor on this thing. The reason I did not do that before installing the header onto the car was because I needed more working room for things such as this. Otherwise, I would hardly be able to get my wrist in here to turn this bolt. Cut. Okay, now that you got the header pretty much installed and all the bolts are snug, you're going to torque them. Now you got to torque them from the innermost bolts, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now you want to torque them all about even. You can't really get a torque wrench on here, so you just want to make sure they're nice and tight. So. Once you got them all tight, then you want to go underneath the car and install the O2 sensor and make sure all the electricals are plugged in, and then you can mount up the catalytic converter. Okay, on the passenger side, remember you have that EGR tube that you need to reinstall. But you're not going to worry about that just yet. First you need to, just like you did on the driver's side, you need to get the first and last bolt in there so we can, at least get it started and everything will align. Now on this case, the oil dipstick has to go between the flange and the pipe here. So you got to be very cautious about dropping this thing in here because you don't want it to get caught on the AC lines or anything like that. So this one seems to be snugging a little bit. So I'm going to pull the oil dipstick. Just kind of get it out of the way for now. And move this pipe up and try to straighten it out a little bit as I do so. Okay, so now that we have a little bit more room, maybe making that vertical will help. Okay, so I'm gonna fit it down in there. Come on. This has become in the way as well, so I'm gonna also have to remove the oil fill pipe. Now you don't need this extended pipe anymore. You can actually just take off the cap, and the cap will actually screw right into the valve cover. So once you have that, make sure you have 2 bolts that are easily reachable, and then slide this sucker in here. Come on. All the lipstick tube's getting caught. In there. caught on something. I can't see what.
I think I can see it's
Hold
like...
on. That one lipstick tube. Just kind of pushing it out of the way. There we go. I need to pass all these hoses. Okay, now this one, get the front bolt started first. And you can see the, just gotta rest it a little bit. There we go. Move the dipstick tube. Remember, just get it started a few turns. There we go. Just a few turns. Now the back one you may have to install using a socket just to get it started. So you will need a 3/8 12-point socket. Along with a short extension to get this bolt started. Okay, you got the first and the last bolt started, and again, just like on the driver's side, you slide the new gasket in there, looping it on both sides, which in this case has to go this way because of the temperature sensor that's in the back. So now that that fits, now you can actually begin installing the rest of the bolts. So get them all started, and it looks like in this case this bolt and this bolt are going to be the two toughest ones, so you got to do those evenly throughout the course of torquing them down. Otherwise, you're going to have to back off the whole header and do it all over again. Okay, you're going to be bending this a few times to get it out of the way, just so you can torque things up. But you want to get the two most difficult bolts going for a little bit, and this is before you go into the car to attach the EGR tube. So this bolt right here is the hardest out of between this one and this one. So you definitely have to get these two going first, because the pipe bends right to them. So you got to get them in enough where you can still have slack for the EGR tube installation. There you go. And again, a ratchet wrench will not work in this situation. Okay, now you've got them in, you got enough slack to play around for the EGR tube, so time to go into the car and install the EGR tube. Okay, now that we have the EGR tube reinstalled, now you begin torquing them up in the same sequence you kind of did. Two hardest bolts go first, which is this one. The number 4 and the number 2 bolt are going to be the hardest ones. So you torque those up, and then you torque them up first, and then you follow with the rest of them. But you want to try to keep them all even, so that way you don't have a whole ton of slack to deal with when you're done. Cut. Okay, now that you've got all the bolts torqued up on the passenger side header, you can continue with the install on the catalytic converter, or you can go ahead and take care of everything up top, which is, already put the oil filler neck tube back on, Already put the engine oil dipstick back in, and now I'm going to put the alternator back on, and then it'd be time to install the catalytic converter. Okay, the alternator is reinstalled, the serpentine belt has been put back on, the headers are fully installed now, and everything up top is hooked back up. The only thing left is to install the catalytic converters that came with the headers. You bolt them up and you're done. Well, you got to hook up your battery first and then you're done. So, next stop is under the car. Okay, now we have the catalytic converters fully installed on the headers for this particular Impala. Now if you notice, we had to get rid of the cross member bracket for the exhaust that we used to attach to the transmission. Reason for that is because the new Cats did not have any brackets to tie up to that center mount, so had to get rid of it. It did not do any harm to the rest of the exhaust. Everything will mount up just fine. So, okay, the only thing left to do, well, there's two things left to do on this project, is to hook up the negative terminal on your battery, jack up the car, remove the jack stands, put it back on the floor, and start it up. So we're going to hook up the battery and get it back on the floor. Okay, once you got the car back on the ground, start it up and let it run for about 5 minutes so the computer can get reacquainted with all the sensors and possibly any new ones that you've installed. And then, after it's run for a few minutes, enjoy the nice new grumble of the installed headers and the improved performance of your exhaust. Go ahead. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you on the next video.